The desert wind carried the acrid smell of aviation fuel and spent gunpowder across Bagram Airfield as Staff Sergeant Kestrel Hex Voss slammed another 30-depleted uranium round into the ammunition bay of the waiting A-10 Thunderbolt. Her calloused hands moved with mechanical precision, each motion honed by 18 months of loading ordnance for pilots who barely acknowledged her existence. The other ground crew called her Ammo Girl behind her back, their voices carrying just enough disdain to remind her where she stood in the hierarchy of this forward operating base. Major Derek Thorne approached the aircraft with his usual swagger, flight suit pressed despite the morning's sortie briefing, aviator sunglasses reflecting the harsh Afghan sun. He'd been assigned this particular warthog for close air support missions along the Pakistani border, dangerous work that required steady hands and nerves of titanium. What he didn't require, in his estimation, was conversation with enlisted personnel whose job description ended at load and clear. Hex kept her head down, focusing on the rhythmic click-click slide of ammunition feeding into the GAU-8 Avenger cannon. Each round weighed nearly a pound, and she'd loaded over 300 of them before her morning coffee had gone cold. Her shoulders ached, her back screamed, but her pace never faltered. This was her war, fought one bullet at a time while others earned glory at 30,000 feet. "How much longer, Sergeant?" Thorne's voice carried the clipped impatience of an officer running behind schedule. 2 minutes, sir." Hex didn't look up from her work. The major drummed his fingers against his helmet, studying the clouds gathering on the horizon. Intelligence had reported Taliban movement in the Korangal Valley, and his squadron was tasked with providing overwatch for a Marine patrol that had been taking contact for 3 days straight. Every minute delayed was another minute those Marines spent pinned down by enemy fire. As Hex secured the final ammunition panel, a gust of wind caught her patrol cap and sent it tumbling across the tarmac. Major Thorne instinctively reached for it, his pilot's reflexes faster than conscious thought. As he lifted the worn fabric, something metallic caught the light from inside the crown. Pinned to the interior, barely visible unless you knew where to look, was a silver star medal. The major's expression shifted from mild annoyance to complete bewilderment. Silver stars weren't handed out for perfect attendance or exemplary coffee brewing. They were earned in moments when ordinary people made extraordinary choices under fire, when courage transcended rank and circumstance. His eyes moved from the medal to the woman who owned it, searching her face for answers to questions he'd never thought to ask. The wind died suddenly, leaving only the distant hum of generators and the weight of unspoken history hanging between them like smoke from a burning aircraft. Hex looked up, finally meeting his gaze with eyes that held depths he was only beginning to fathom. Staff Sergeant Kestrel Voss had earned her call sign, Hex, during her 3rd deployment to Iraq, though the story behind it remained classified at levels far above Major Thorne's clearance. What wasn't classified was her previous military occupational specialty, 15T, a 60 Black Hawk crew chief and door gunner. Before she'd been reassigned to ammunition loading, before the incident that had grounded her permanently, she'd spent 4 years strapped into the cabin of helicopters flying into places where maps ended and nightmares began. The major turned the cap over in his hands, nodding the faded name tape and the careful way the medal had been concealed. "Sergeant, I need to ask you something, and I need an honest answer." Hex straightened, her posture shifting from enlisted indifference to something approaching military bearing. "Yes, sir." "This medal, how did you earn it?" The question hung in the desert air like a heat mirage, shimmering with implications neither of them fully understood. Around them, the daily rhythm of the airfield continued, mechanics turning wrenches, pilots reviewing flight plans, the distant whine of turbine engines spinning up for another day of controlled violence. But in this moment, beside an aircraft loaded with enough firepower to level a city block, 2 soldiers stood on the precipice of a conversation that would change everything. Hex took her cap back, her fingers brushing against the fabric with something approaching reverence. "It was Fallujah, sir. November 2004. I was flying with the 101st Airborne, providing close air support for Marines pushing through the city." Major Thorne found himself leaning forward despite his attempt at professional detachment. Fallujah had been a meat grinder, urban warfare at its most brutal and unforgiving. Anyone who'd served there carried scars, visible or otherwise. "We took an RPG through the tail rotor," Hex continued, her voice steady but distant, as if she were watching the events unfold on a screen rather than reliving them. "Pilot fought it all the way down, but we were going to crash in a courtyard surrounded by insurgent positions. I had about 30 seconds to make a choice." The major waited, recognizing the cadence of someone who told this story to review boards and psychiatrists, but never to another soldier who might understand. "I stayed on the gun," she said simply. "Laid down suppressing fire while the crew evacuated wounded Marines from the crash site. Took shrapnel in my shoulder and leg, but I kept that 50 cal singing until the QRF arrived." Major Thorne studied her face, nodding the small scar above her left eyebrow, the way she favored her right leg when she thought no one was watching. The pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known existed began falling into place. "That's not why you're loading ammunition now," he said, and it wasn't a question. The wind picked up again, carrying with it the sound of rotor blades in the distance. For 18 months, Staff Sergeant Hex Voss had been invisible to the pilots she served. They saw her uniform, her rank, her function, never the person beneath. Major Thorne was beginning to understand that invisibility might have been exactly what she'd wanted. Some wars were fought in the sky, others in the public eye of commendations and promotions. But some battles were private affairs, waged in the quiet spaces between heartbeats, where heroes learned to hide their medals and warriors chose to serve in shadows. "The crash wasn't my fault," Hex said, answering his unspoken question. "But afterwards I couldn't fly anymore. Medical Review Board found traumatic brain injury from the impact. Nothing severe enough to discharge me, but enough to ground me permanently." She gestured toward the A-10, its shark-toothed nose arc grinning in the morning sun. "So I do this now. Make sure other people's aircraft are ready to bring everyone home." Major Thorne felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that transcended rank and protocol. He'd been flying combat missions for 6 years, accumulating air medals and commendations like collector's items. But he'd never faced the choice between personal safety and mission accomplishment with the stark clarity that Hex had experienced in that Fallujah courtyard. The silver star represented a moment of pure courage, distilled to its essence and tested by fire. "Why keep it hidden?" he asked. Hex secured the ammunition bay panel with practiced efficiency, her movements economical and precise. "Because it doesn't matter anymore, sir. What matters is making sure you have everything you need to complete your mission." Around them, the airfield hummed with pre-flight activity. Crew chiefs performed final inspections, ordnance teams verified weapons loads, meteorology specialists updated weather briefings. It was a choreographed dance of military precision, each person playing their part in the larger symphony of air power projection. But suddenly, Major Thorne saw it differently. He saw the network of expertise and dedication that made his flights possible, the countless hands that touched his aircraft before he ever strapped in. The radio on his vest crackled to life. "Reaper 11 Tower, you're cleared for engine start, winds 270 at 15, gusts to 25. "Roger Tower, Reaper 11 starting engines." Major Thorne looked at Hex one more time, nodding the quiet competence in her posture, the way she stepped back to give him room without being asked. "Sergeant," he said, his voice carrying a weight it hadn't held before. "Yes, sir. Thank you for the ammunition load and for—" He gestured vaguely at the space between them, searching for words to encompass everything he was beginning to understand. Hex nodded once, a movement so slight it might have been imagined. "Bring them home, sir." The turbine engines of the A-10 began their distinctive whine, twin General Electric TF-34s spinning up to operational speed. Major Thorne climbed into the cockpit, but as he began his pre-flight checklist, he found his attention divided between instrument readings and the figure of Staff Sergeant Voss moving to the next aircraft in line. Her movements held the same mechanical precision, the same quiet dedication, but now he saw something else. The bearing of someone who understood exactly what those aircraft represented and exactly how much depended on getting every detail right. As he taxied toward the active runway, Major Thorne keyed his radio. Bagram Tower, Reaper 11 requesting permission to speak with ground control. Reaper 11 Tower, go ahead. Tower, I need to know the name of the ammunition specialist who loaded my aircraft this morning. There was a pause, long enough for the major to wonder if he'd violated some protocol he wasn't aware of. Finally, Reaper 11, that would be Staff Sergeant Voss, call sign Hex. The call sign hit him like a revelation. In military aviation, call signs weren't arbitrary nicknames. They were earned through actions, personality traits, or memorable incidents. They became part of a pilot's identity, printed on flight suits and painted on aircraft. But Hex was ground crew now, and ground crew didn't typically maintain their aviation call signs, unless they'd earned them in ways that made forgetting impossible. Roger Tower, Reaper 11 rolling. The accelerated down the runway, its twin engines pushing 16,000 pounds of armored aircraft and ordnance into the thin mountain air. As the wheels left the ground, Major Thorne caught a glimpse of the ammunition loading area through his canopy. Staff Sergeant Hex was already bent over the next aircraft, her movements unchanged by their conversation, her focus absolute. But something had changed in that brief exchange, something that would ripple outward in ways neither of them could have predicted. For the first time in 18 months, someone had seen past the uniform and the function to the person beneath. And for Major Thorne, the weight of his mission had acquired a new dimension, not just the Marines he was flying to support, but the quiet professional who had made his flight possible. The landscape of Afghanistan spread below him like a tactical map, all brown ridges and hidden valleys where shadows concealed both sanctuary and threat. Somewhere down there, Marines were counting on him to provide the precision firepower that would allow them to complete their mission and return home. The ammunition bay behind him held 1,174 rounds of 30 depleted uranium, each one loaded by hands that had once gripped machine gun triggers in defense of fallen comrades. As he banked toward the Korangal Valley, Major Thorne made a decision that would change the trajectory of two military careers and challenge every assumption about valor, recognition, and the true meaning of service above self. The radio crackled with the voice of the forward air controller embedded with the Marine Patrol. Reaper 11, this is Chaos 27. We have troops in contact, grid 417-95682. Multiple enemy positions engaging from the ridge line to our north. How copy? Chaos 27, Reaper 11. Good copy on grid and situation. I'm 5 minutes out with a full load of 30 Mike. Can you mark enemy positions with smoke? Reaper 11, negative on smoke. We're pinned down pretty good here. Enemy positions are approximately 400 meters north of our location, firing from what appears to be prepared fighting positions along the ridge. Major Thorne could hear the strain in the controller's voice, the controlled tension of someone coordinating air support while under direct fire. He pushed the throttles forward, feeling the A-10's engines respond with their characteristic growl. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was rushing into combat in an aircraft prepared by someone who could no longer participate in the fight herself. Chaos 27, Reaper 11. I have you in sight. Can you pop red smoke to mark friendly positions? Below, a crimson plume rose from a cluster of rocks barely visible against the mountainside. The Marines had found whatever cover they could among the boulders and scrub vegetation, but their position was clearly untenable. Muzzle flashes winked from the ridge line 400 meters to the north, a textbook ambush position with excellent fields of fire and multiple escape routes. Major Thorne rolled into his attack run, the familiar weight of G-forces pressing him into his ejection seat. The targeting system painted green squares around the enemy positions, computer-calculated solutions scrolling across his heads-up display. But as his finger found the trigger, he hesitated for a fraction of a second. In that moment, he wasn't just a pilot delivering ordnance on target. He was the continuation of a chain that began with Staff Sergeant Hex Voss carefully loading each round, checking each connection, ensuring that when this moment came, the weapon would function exactly as designed. Her hands had touched every bullet he was about to fire, her expertise and dedication flowing through the aircraft's systems like an electric current. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon erupted with its distinctive roar, sending a stream of depleted uranium rounds downrange at nearly 4,000 feet per second. The enemy position disappeared in a cloud of dust and debris, secondary explosions suggesting ammunition or fuel storage. Major Thorne pulled up and banked for another pass, the aircraft responding with the crisp precision that made the A-10 legendary among ground forces. Reaper 11 Chaos 27. Outstanding work. Enemy fire has ceased. We're moving to secure the area. But even as he acknowledged the controller's praise, Major Thorne's thoughts remained divided between the tactical situation and the conversation he'd had on the ground. Something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of how warfare actually functioned, how the seemingly simple act of loading ammunition connected to moments like this when lives hung in the balance. The flight back to Bagram gave him time to process what he'd learned and what he intended to do about it. Staff Sergeant Hex Voss was securing the tools of her trade when she noticed Major Thorne approaching across the tarmac. His flight suit showed the telltale signs of a successful mission, slight dampness from perspiration, the satisfied posture of a pilot who delivered ordnance on target and brought his aircraft home intact. She'd seen hundreds of pilots return from combat missions, but something in his bearing suggested this debrief would be different. "Sergeant," he said, stopping at regulation distance but somehow making the formal address feel less formal. The ammunition performed flawlessly, textbook function on all systems. Hex nodded, continuing her post-flight inspection of the loading equipment. "That's what it's designed to do, sir." "I need to ask you something else," Major Thorne said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd spent the flight back rehearsing this conversation. "When you were flying, what was your primary mission set?" The question was professionally phrased, but Hex recognized the subtext. She'd been expecting this conversation since the moment he'd seen her medal. "Casualty evacuation and close air support, sir. We flew medevac missions primarily, with secondary tasking for troop insertion and extraction. Combat search and rescue. When required, yes, sir." Major Thorne absorbed this information, pieces of the puzzle continuing to fall into place. CSAR missions were among the most dangerous in military aviation, flying into contested airspace to extract downed aircrew or isolated ground forces. The job required technical flying skills, tactical awareness, and the kind of courage that couldn't be taught in any classroom. "The incident that grounded you," he said carefully, "it wasn't just a crash." Hex set down her tools and faced him directly, recognizing that evasion was no longer an option. "No, sir, it wasn't just a crash." Around them, the evening shift change was beginning. Day crew personnel secured their equipment and prepared to transfer responsibility to the night crew. The rhythm of 24/7 operations continued unchanged, but in this corner of the flight line, two soldiers were approaching a moment of truth that would resonate far beyond their individual careers. "Tell me what really happened," Major Thorne said, and it was both a request and an order. Hex looked up at the darkening sky, watching navigation lights blink against the first stars. When she spoke, her voice carried the flat precision of someone reciting from an after-action report that had been reviewed, analyzed, and classified. We were extracting a reconnaissance team that had been compromised. 4 Rangers, surrounded and taking heavy fire in a compound about 15 kilometers northeast of Fallujah. The LZ was hot, multiple RPG teams, small arms fire from prepared positions. Standard CSAR protocol called for suppressive fires before insertion, but the Rangers were running low on ammunition and couldn't hold their position much longer. Major Thorne found himself holding his breath, recognizing the setup for the kind of decision that defined military careers and haunted military professionals for the rest of their lives. Our pilot made the call to go in without prep fires. Time was more important than safety margins. We took multiple hits on approach, but we got the Rangers loaded. That's when the RPG took out our tail rotor. The technical details were important, Major Thorne knew, but they were also a way of avoiding the emotional reality of what had happened. You stayed on the gun during the crash sequence. Someone had to suppress the enemy positions around the LZ. If we'd gone down and the insurgents had overrun the crash site. Hex shrugged, the gesture encompassing all the tactical implications she didn't need to articulate. But you were injured. Shrapnel from the RPG blast, concussion from the impact. I was unconscious for the actual crash, but I came to with the aircraft on fire and the Rangers still aboard. The pilot and co-pilot were dead. Major Thorne felt something cold settle in his stomach. You extracted the Rangers alone. I did what anyone would have done, sir. The aircraft was burning, and there were 4 wounded soldiers who needed medical attention. I got them clear of the wreckage and established a defensive perimeter until the QRF arrived. The major studied her face, nodding the way she recounted events with clinical detachment, as if describing someone else's actions. That's why you received the Silver Star. The medal wasn't for the crash, sir. It was for the 37 minutes between the crash and the arrival of the Quick Reaction Force, maintaining defensive positions while providing medical aid to 4 wounded Rangers with multiple hostile forces maneuvering to overrun our position. The weight of this revelation settled over Major Thorne like a physical presence. 37 minutes might not sound like much in the abstract, but in combat time, with wounded soldiers, limited ammunition, and enemy forces closing in, it was an eternity. The kind of eternity that separated ordinary soldiers from the ones whose stories were told in hushed tones at military colleges and written into the official histories of units that prided themselves on never leaving anyone behind. The traumatic brain injury, he said, understanding now why she'd been grounded. Mild but persistent, affects my spatial orientation and depth perception, fine for ground operations but disqualifying for flight status. Hex picked up her tools again, a signal that the conversation was approaching its natural conclusion. Which is why I load ammunition now, sir. It's important work and I'm good at it. But Major Thorne wasn't ready to let the conversation end. Something was crystallizing in his mind, a sense that this encounter was more than coincidence or casual curiosity. Sergeant, I have a question that's going to sound unusual. Hex waited, her expression neutral but alert. How would you feel about flying again? The question hung in the air between them like an unexploded ordnance, dangerous and unpredictable. Hex set down her tools completely now, turning to face him with an expression that cycled through confusion, hope, and wariness in rapid succession. Sir, my medical status is permanent. I'm grounded indefinitely. I'm not talking about pilot status, Major Thorne said, his voice gaining confidence as the idea solidified. I'm talking about flying as aircrew. The A-10 has provisions for a weapons systems officer in certain configurations. Someone who understands ordnance, understands combat operations, and has the experience to coordinate between air and ground elements. Hex stared at him for a long moment, processing the implications. "Sir, I'm not qualified as a WSO. I don't have the training or the clearances." Training can be arranged. Clearances can be processed. What can't be taught is combat experience, tactical awareness, and the kind of judgment that earned you a Silver Star. Major Thorne paused, recognizing that he was about to cross a line from professional interest to personal advocacy. "Sergeant, what I'm about to propose is irregular, possibly unprecedented, and will require approvals from people whose names appear on organizational charts I've never seen. But I think you belong in the air, not on the ground. And I think there are missions we could accomplish together that neither of us could accomplish alone." The sun was setting behind the mountains now, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded both of them of tracer fire and burning fuel. Around them, the night shift was taking control of flight operations, preparing for another cycle of missions that would continue until every objective was accomplished and every soldier brought home. Hex looked up at the aircraft she'd been servicing, its angular lines and armored bulk somehow less intimidating now that she was considering the possibility of flying in it rather than simply loading it. "What kind of missions?" Major Thorne smiled, recognizing the shift from skepticism to interest. "The kind that require someone who understands what it means to stay on the gun when everything goes wrong." The idea that Major Thorne had planted in Staff Sergeant Hex Voss's mind grew like wildfire over the following days. She found herself studying the A-10's technical manuals during off-duty hours, researching weapons systems officer duties and qualifications with the methodical intensity she'd once applied to medical evacuation procedures. The possibility of returning to flight status, even in a limited capacity, awakened something in her that had been dormant since the crash that had grounded her. But bureaucracy moved at the speed of bureaucracy, regardless of individual motivation or combat necessity. The formal request for Hex's transfer to aircrew status would require reviews by multiple commands, medical evaluations, security clearance updates, and training programs that existed more in theory than in practice. The A-10 community had never seriously considered two-person crews for standard missions, and the precedent Major Thorne was attempting to establish would challenge decades of doctrine and procedure. While the paperwork made its way through official channels, an unexpected opportunity presented itself. Intelligence reports indicated a high-value target operating in a remote valley near the Pakistani border, a Taliban commander who'd been coordinating attacks on coalition supply convoys. The mission profile was complex, precision strikes on multiple targets in a narrow window of opportunity, with high probability of civilian casualties if the attack wasn't executed perfectly. Major Thorne found himself in the operations briefing room at 400 hours, studying satellite imagery and electronic intercepts that painted a picture of surgical precision requirements beyond the capability of standard close air support missions. The target compound was located in a valley surrounded by civilian structures, with escape routes that would take the Taliban commander out of range within minutes of any attack. "The window is approximately 4 minutes, the intelligence officer explained, highlighting the compound on the large screen display. "From the time he arrives until he moves to the secondary location. Multiple buildings, multiple vehicles, and we need positive identification before engagement." Colonel Sarah Martinez, the squadron commander, studied the imagery with the expression of someone calculating acceptable risk versus mission requirements. "What's our confidence level on civilian casualties?" "High probability of collateral damage with standard munitions and targeting procedures. The compound is less than 50 meters from a school and a medical clinic." Major Thorne raised his hand. "Ma'am, I have a request that might sound irregular." Colonel Martinez turned to him with the patient expression of a commander who'd heard every possible excuse for why missions couldn't be accomplished as briefed. "Go ahead, Major." I'd like permission to fly this mission with a weapons systems officer, someone with experience in precision targeting and civilian casualty mitigation." The room fell silent. A-10 pilots flew solo. It was doctrine, tradition, and the configuration that maximized the aircraft's effectiveness. Adding a second person to the cockpit was essentially admitting that one pilot couldn't handle the mission requirements. "Major, the A-10 doesn't operate with weapons systems officers," Colonel Martinez said, her voice carrying the weight of someone explaining basic facts to a junior officer. "Ma'am, it can. The aircraft has provisions for a second crew member in specialized configurations, and I believe the mission requirements justify the exception." Colonel Martinez studied the satellite imagery again, noting the proximity of civilian structures and the narrow margin for error. The Taliban commander represented a significant intelligence opportunity. His capture or elimination could disrupt operations across multiple provinces, but a failed mission that resulted in civilian casualties would have strategic implications far beyond tactical success. "Who did you have in mind for your WSO, Major?" "Staff Sergeant Voss, ma'am. She has extensive combat experience, understands precision targeting requirements, and has demonstrated judgment under pressure that exceeds normal parameters." The intelligence officer looked confused. "Staff Sergeant Voss is ground crew, sir, ammunition specialist. She's a former flight crew member with combat decorations and the specific skill set this mission requires." Major Thorne met Colonel Martinez's gaze directly. "Ma'am, I believe this mission has a higher probability of success with Sergeant Voss as my WSO than without her." Colonel Martinez was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications of what Major Thorne was proposing. Unconventional solutions sometimes produced exceptional results, but they also carried unconventional risks. If the mission succeeded, it would validate an innovative approach to complex targeting scenarios. If it failed, her career would bear the responsibility for approving an untested configuration in a high-stakes environment. "Major, assuming I approve this request, and I'm not saying I will, how would you configure the aircraft and crew responsibilities?" "Sergeant Voss would occupy the instructor pilot seat with access to targeting systems and communications. She would handle target identification, weapons selection, and coordination with ground forces, while I focus on aircraft control and tactical maneuvering." "And her clearance level for this intelligence?" "She holds a secret clearance with combat experience compartments. The additional access can be granted under operational necessity protocols." Colonel Martinez turned to the intelligence officer. "How time-sensitive is this target?" "Ma'am, we expect the subject to be at the primary location within 72 hours. After that, the intelligence suggests he'll be moving to areas outside our operational reach." The mathematics of military decision-making were brutal in their simplicity. Mission success justified almost any reasonable risk. Mission failure, particularly with civilian casualties, created political and strategic complications that could affect operations across the entire theater. Colonel Martinez had seen promising military careers end because officers had chosen the safe path when the mission required innovation. "Major Thorne, you have 48 hours to prepare your crew and aircraft. This mission is approved on the condition that all safety and security protocols are followed to the letter. Any deviation from briefed parameters will result in immediate mission abort." "Yes, ma'am, understood." As the briefing concluded and personnel filed out of the operations center, Major Thorne felt the weight of what he'd committed himself and Hex to accomplish. The mission represented more than a tactical objective. It was a test of whether unconventional approaches could produce conventional success, whether the combination of his flying skills and her combat experience could create capabilities that exceeded the sum of their individual contributions. Finding Staff Sergeant Hex Voss required a brief search of the usual locations, where off-duty personnel gathered to decompress from the stress of deployment operations. She wasn't in the recreation tent or the dining facility, and her assigned quarters were empty. Finally, Major Thorne found her in the base chapel, sitting in the back row with her eyes closed and her hands folded in an attitude that might have been prayer or simply quiet reflection. "Sergeant," he said softly, not wanting to startle her. Hex opened her eyes and turned to face him, nodding the expression of controlled excitement that suggested significant developments. "Yes, sir. I need to talk to you about a mission, a flying mission." The chapel was empty except for the two of them, its simple wooden cross and basic altar providing an atmosphere of calm that contrasted sharply with the complexity of what Major Thorne was about to propose. Hex had come here not for religious reasons, but for the silence, the rare space on a military base where the constant noise of aircraft engines and equipment operation faded to a manageable level. "Sir, I thought we discussed this. My medical status has been reviewed by the flight surgeon. Your injuries don't disqualify you from aircrew duty in a non-pilot capacity." Major Thorne sat down in the pew beside her, close enough for quiet conversation, but maintaining the professional distance required by their respective ranks. "Sergeant, I'm going to ask you to do something that's probably going to scare the hell out of you." Hex turned to face him directly, recognizing the tone of voice that preceded mission briefings for operations that existed at the outer edge of standard procedures. "What kind of mission?" "High-value target, precision engagement, zero margin for error. Taliban commander who's been coordinating attacks on supply convoys. The target is surrounded by civilian structures. The engagement window is approximately 4 minutes, and standard targeting procedures have too high a probability of collateral damage." The tactical picture painted itself in Hex's mind with the clarity of her combat experience. You need someone to handle target identification and weapons coordination while you focus on flying. Exactly. Someone who understands the difference between acceptable risk and unacceptable consequences. Someone who's made decisions under fire when lives depended on getting everything exactly right. Hex was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. Flying again, even as aircrew rather than pilot, represented a return to the world she'd been forced to leave behind. But it also represented exposure to the kind of traumatic stress that had contributed to her medical grounding in the first place. "Sir, I need to ask you something directly, and I need an honest answer." "Go ahead." "Are you asking me to fly this mission because you think I'm the best person for the job, or because you feel sorry for me?" The question cut to the heart of Major Thorne's motivations with surgical precision. He'd been asking himself the same thing since the idea had first occurred to him, and the answer was more complex than either simple explanation could encompass. "Both," he said finally. "I do think you're the best person for the job. Your experience and judgment make you uniquely qualified for this kind of precision mission. But I also think you belong in the air, not loading ammunition on the ground. And maybe this mission is an opportunity to prove that to people who make decisions about military careers." Hex appreciated the honesty, even as it complicated her decision-making process. Pity assignments rarely ended well for anyone involved, but genuine operational need was different. If Major Thorne believed her skills could contribute to mission success, that was a professional assessment based on measurable criteria. "What's the timeline?" 48 hours for mission preparation. Target window opens in 72 hours. "And if the mission succeeds?" "Then we've demonstrated that unconventional crew configurations can produce exceptional results, which might open doors that have been closed since your medical review." Hex stood up, walking to the chapel's simple stained glass window that filtered the harsh Afghan sunlight into colors that suggested something gentler than the landscape outside. "And if the mission fails, then we accept responsibility for the failure and move on with our careers as they stand now." The mathematics were simple, but the emotional calculation was more complex. Returning to flight operations meant confronting the demons she'd been avoiding since the crash, accepting the possibility of failure or injury in pursuit of objectives that might or might not justify the risk. But it also meant returning to the work she'd been trained to do, the missions that gave her military service meaning beyond simple task completion. "I'll do it," she said, turning back to face him, "but I have one condition." "Name it." "If I freeze up, if the brain injury affects my performance, if I become a liability instead of an asset, you abort the mission immediately. No hesitation, no second chances. The mission is more important than my pride." Major Thorne nodded, recognizing the statement as both a professional commitment and a personal acknowledgement of her limitations. "Agreed. But Sergeant." "Yes, sir." "I don't think you're going to freeze up. I think you're going to remind everyone why they gave you that silver star in the first place." The preparation for their unprecedented mission began immediately. Colonel Martinez had authorized access to classified intelligence materials and specialized training resources, but the timeline remained compressed by operational necessity. Hex found herself in briefing rooms she'd never seen before, studying satellite imagery and electronic intercepts that painted a detailed picture of the target and surrounding area. The Taliban commander, identified only as Objective Falcon, had been tracked through a combination of signals intelligence and human sources. His operational pattern suggested a meeting at the target compound within the next 72 hours, where he would coordinate with local cell leaders before moving to a secondary location across the Pakistani border. The intelligence was solid, but the window of opportunity was narrow and unlikely to repeat itself. Major Thorne worked with aircraft maintenance personnel to configure the A-10 for two-person operations. The instructor pilot seat hadn't been used for combat missions, but it provided access to targeting systems and communications equipment that would allow Hex to coordinate between air and ground elements. Additional displays were installed to give her real-time access to weapon systems status and targeting information. The weapon's load was equally critical. Standard 30 ammunition would be too destructive for the precision required, so the mission called for a combination of precision-guided munitions and smaller caliber weapons. 2 AGM-65 Maverick missiles for the primary target, with 25 ammunition for secondary objectives and defensive purposes. But the technical preparation was only part of the equation. Hex spent hours in flight simulators, reacquainting herself with aircraft systems and practicing coordination procedures with Major Thorne. The simulators couldn't replicate the psychological pressure of actual combat, but they provided an opportunity to identify potential problems before they became critical failures. Target acquired, bearing 085 degrees, range 4 kilometers.